My name is John Miller, and just over a year ago, I was a janitor. If you'd seen me back then, you probably wouldn't have given me a second glance, just a guy in a worn-out uniform, pushing a mop across endless tiled floors. I worked the graveyard shift at an office building downtown, cleaning up after people who barely noticed me. Every night felt the same. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I scrubbed scuff marks off the floor or emptied trash bins overflowing with discarded coffee cups and crumpled paper. The laughter of the office workers faded as they left for the evening, their tailored suits and polished shoes mocking my scuffed boots and frayed shirt. They'd give me a quick nod, polite but distant, and disappear into the night. I told myself it didn't bother me, but deep down, it did. It wasn't just the work, it was the feeling that life had passed me by. At 35, I lived in a cramped studio apartment that I could barely afford, drank instant coffee that tasted like cardboard, and rode a bus that reeked of stale air and too many passengers. I didn't dream anymore. Dreams were for people who could afford them. But that night, one cold Thursday in January, everything started to change. I was cleaning the executive suite when I spotted something shiny under the desk of Mr. Larson, the CEO. It was a book, the kind with a glossy cover that screamed ambition. The title? The Millionaire Mindset. I couldn't resist. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. Words like resilience, opportunity, risk-taking leapt out at me. For a moment, I let myself imagine what it would be like to escape the rut I was in, to have a life where I wasn't invisible. Then reality hit. I was a janitor, not some high-powered executive. Who was I kidding? I put the book back where I found it and finished my shift, brushing off the ideas it had stirred in me. But as I walked home that night, the words lingered in my mind. Maybe, just maybe, that book hadn't landed in my hands by accident. The next few nights, I couldn't stop thinking about that book. It was ridiculous, really. I mean, what did a guy like me have to do with something like the millionaire mindset? But every time I grabbed my mop or tossed another bag of trash into the dumpster, those words, resilience, opportunity, risk, kept playing on repeat in my head. A few days later, fate decided to throw me a curveball. It was nearing midnight, and I was finishing up on the 15th floor when the elevator dinged. Usually, the building was empty by that time, but as I turned around, I saw a man step out. He was well-dressed but looked stressed, his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled. "Hey," he said, startling me. "You wouldn't happen to have a phone charger, would you?" I hesitated. I didn't usually talk to the office workers, let alone executives who stayed late. Yeah, I think so," I said, digging into my janitor's cart where I kept a tangle of random odds and ends. "Thanks," he said, taking the charger and plugging his phone into the wall. "Late night, huh?" "Every night," I replied with a shrug. He smiled faintly, then glanced at my name tag. "John, right? I've seen you around. You keep this place spotless." I wasn't sure what to say. No one ever noticed me, let alone complimented my work. Thanks. Just doing my job." For a moment, it was quiet, and I thought he'd leave, but instead, he asked, "So, what's your story, John? You always wanted to be a janitor?" The question caught me off guard. "Not exactly," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Life just turned out this way." He nodded, like he understood more than he let on. "I get it. Life has a way of boxing you in, doesn't it?" Before I could reply, his phone buzzed, and he grabbed it. "Thanks for the charger, John," he said, heading back toward the elevator. "You ever need advice or anything, look me up. Name's Simon Hayes." I stood there, dumbfounded. Simon Hayes, the Simon Hayes. Founder of Hayes Ventures, the investment firm whose name was plastered across half the city. I'd seen his face in magazines, heard his name in business news. As the elevator doors closed, I realized I'd just met one of the richest men in the city. And for some reason, he'd taken the time to talk to me. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something I couldn't yet understand. That night, I couldn't sleep. My encounter with Simon Hayes kept replaying in my mind. Why had he asked about my story? What did he mean by, boxing you in? It felt like he'd looked straight through me, past the uniform, past the mop, and seen something I wasn't sure even existed anymore, potential. The next morning, I woke up with an idea buzzing in my head. I didn't know where it came from, but it felt like a spark, tiny, fragile, but burning just enough to demand my attention. If Simon Hayes could build a fortune from nothing, why couldn't I? Of course, the voice of doubt was right there to answer. Because you're a janitor, John. You don't have money. You don't have connections. You don't even know where to start. But then I remembered that book under the CEO's desk. Maybe that was the start. That evening, I decided to take a chance. After finishing my shift, I went back to Mr. Larson's office. The book was still there, exactly where I'd left it. I hesitated, heart pounding, then slipped it into my bag. I wasn't stealing it, I told myself I'd put it back as soon as I was done. But I needed to read it, to figure out what was so special about it that it had lodged itself in my brain. When I got home, I didn't even bother changing out of my uniform. I sat on my creaky futon, flipped open the book, and started reading. The first chapter hit me like a punch to the gut. It was all about mindset, about how the way you think shapes the life you live. It asked questions I didn't want to answer. Do you believe you're stuck where you are? Are you living on autopilot? What's stopping you from taking control of your life? By the time I finished the chapter, I realized something. I had spent my entire life blaming circumstances for where I was. My lack of money, my dead-end job, my missed opportunities, they weren't the problem. My mindset was. That realization was terrifying, but it also lit a fire under me. If my own thoughts had kept me stuck, then maybe, just maybe, they could also set me free. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote down a goal. It wasn't big or flashy, but it felt monumental to me. In 1 year, I will no longer be a janitor. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I made myself a promise right then and there. I was going to figure it out, one step at a time. Writing that goal down was easy. Believing I could achieve it, that was a whole different story. The next day, as I pushed my mop across the lobby floor, doubt started creeping back in. I couldn't shake the thought, what if you're setting yourself up to fail? But then I remembered the book. It said that progress wasn't about leaps and bounds, it was about small, deliberate steps. So, I decided to take my first step that very day. During my lunch break, I sat in the employee lounge, scrolling through my phone. I didn't have much, but I did have one advantage: access. Working in an office building meant I saw people from all walks of life: accountants, marketers, techies, even executives. Maybe there was something I could learn just by watching them. That's when I noticed Dave, one of the IT guys. He wasn't anything like the flashy executives upstairs, but he had a reputation for being sharp and approachable. I saw him sitting alone at a table, eating a sandwich, and decided to take a chance. "Hey, mind if I sit here?" I asked, tray in hand. He looked up, surprised but friendly. "Sure, go ahead." For a few minutes, we made small talk, weather, the latest office gossip, that kind of thing. Then I shifted the conversation. "So, Dave," I said, trying to sound casual, "how'd you get into IT?" He chuckled. "Honestly? I just got curious one day. Started teaching myself basic coding online. Figured it out as I went." "Wait, you learned all that on your own?" I asked, genuinely impressed. "Yeah. There's tons of free resources out there. You'd be surprised what you can do if you're willing to put in the time." That stuck with me. Dave didn't have a fancy degree or a rich family backing him up. He had curiosity and a willingness to learn. After my shift, I went straight home and started searching online for free courses. It was overwhelming at first, there were so many options, and I didn't even know what I wanted to learn. But then I remembered something I'd heard in passing: tech is the future. I decided to start with something simple, basic coding. It felt ridiculous at first, like I was playing pretend. But as I worked through my first tutorial, something unexpected happened. For the first time in years, I felt excited. Each line of code I wrote felt like a tiny victory, a small step toward a future I could barely imagine. I wasn't sure where it would lead, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to stop. That night, I fell asleep with my laptop still open on my futon, the words of the tutorial page glowing softly in the dark. Learning to code became my obsession. Every spare moment I had outside of work was spent glued to my laptop. It wasn't easy. Most nights, I'd be so exhausted after my janitor shift that my eyes would blur over the screen. But every time I thought about quitting, I'd glance at the goal I'd taped to my wall. In 1 year, I will no longer be a janitor. About a month into my journey, I hit a roadblock. I'd gotten through the basics of coding, but I had no clue how to apply it. Sure, I could write some simple programs, but who was going to pay me for that? That's when a spark of inspiration hit me during my shift. As I was cleaning the break room, I overheard 2 accountants talking about how much they hated their outdated software. "I swear, if I have to manually enter these numbers one more time, I'm going to lose it," one of them groaned. I didn't say anything at the time, but an idea was already forming in my head. Maybe I couldn't build the next big app, but what if I could solve smaller problems for people right here in the building? The next day, during lunch, I approached Dave again. "Hey, can I ask you something?" I said, trying not to sound desperate. "Sure, what's up?" If I wanted to build something simple, like a tool to make accounting tasks easier, where would I start? Dave raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Well, first, you need to figure out exactly what problem you're solving. Then, you choose the right platform to build on. For accounting, maybe something like Excel macros or Python scripts could work." I didn't understand half of what he said, but I nodded like I did. That night, I dove headfirst into learning about Python. It was daunting at first, like trying to read a book in a foreign language, but the more I practiced, the clearer it became. Within 2 weeks, I'd built a basic script that automated some of the data entry tasks I'd overheard the accountants complaining about. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. Now came the hard part: pitching it. I was terrified. I mean, who was I to offer anything to these professionals? But I also knew I couldn't stay in my comfort zone if I wanted to change my life. So, one evening, as the office was winding down, I approached the accountant who'd been complaining about the software. "Excuse me," I said, holding my breath. "I couldn't help but overhear you the other day. I built something that might help with your data entry." He looked at me, puzzled, but curious. "You built something? What do you mean?" I showed him the script on my laptop and explained how it worked. He gave me a skeptical look but agreed to give it a try. 2 days later, he found me during my shift. "Hey, John, that thing you made? It's actually pretty good. How much do you want for it?" I froze. I hadn't even thought about charging him. I don't know. $50. He laughed. 50. No way. This thing saved me hours of work. Here's $200, and if you can tweak it a bit, I'll tell the other guys in my department about it. That $200 was more money than I'd ever earned from anything outside of cleaning floors. And just like that, my side hustle was born. That $200 felt like $1 million to me. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the validation. For the first time in my life, someone had paid me for something I created with my own 2 hands, and my brain. That feeling. It was addicting. Over the next few weeks, I doubled down on my hustle. Every night after work, I was on my laptop, either learning new coding tricks or tweaking my script. True to his word, the accountant told a few of his colleagues about what I'd done, and soon, they were asking if I could create tools to make their tasks easier, too. The request started small. Automate this report. Simplify that spreadsheet. Each time, I'd charge a little more, testing the waters. By the end of the month, I'd made close to $1,000 on top of my janitor wages. I couldn't believe it. $1,000. But it wasn't just about the extra income. The more I worked on these small projects, the more I realized something important: I was good at this. For the first time, I felt like I had a skill that could actually take me somewhere. One night, as I was wrapping up my shift, Dave, the IT guy, caught me in the break room. "Hey, John," he said, "I hear you've been building stuff for the accounting team." I nodded, a little embarrassed. "Yeah, just some small tools. Nothing fancy." He smirked. "Small tools, huh? You know, some of the best software in the world started as small tools. Ever think about scaling up?" "Scaling up?" I repeated, confused. "Yeah. You've got a knack for solving problems. If you really want to make a mark, think bigger. Don't just build for a few people, build for a lot of people." His words stuck with me. I'd been so focused on making a few extra bucks that I hadn't considered the bigger picture. What if I could take what I was doing and turn it into something much larger? That night, I stayed up until dawn researching platforms and tools that could help me create software for a wider audience. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew one thing: I couldn't stop now. The following week, an opportunity presented itself that I never saw coming. One of the executives in the building, an intimidating guy named Mr. Walker, stopped me in the hall. "You're John, right?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Yes, sir," I said, trying not to look as nervous as I felt. "I hear you've been building some tools for the accountants. Think you could create something for my team? We've got a reporting system that's a nightmare to deal with." I blinked, stunned. Mr. Walker was one of the higher-ups. He wasn't the kind of guy who'd normally give someone like me the time of day. I think so," I stammered. "I'd need to know more about what you need, but I can try." "Good," he said, handing me his business card. "Come by my office tomorrow at 5 p.m. We'll talk." The stakes had just been raised. This wasn't some side project for a friendly accountant, this was the real deal. And I had no idea if I was ready for it. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. My nerves were shot, my stomach twisted in knots. Meeting with Mr. Walker felt like stepping into uncharted territory, like being thrown into the deep end without a life jacket. All day, I rehearsed what I would say. I knew I had to sound confident, even if I wasn't. By 5 p.m., I was standing outside his office, gripping my laptop like it was a shield. "Come in," he called when I knocked. I stepped inside, immediately feeling small in the shadow of his sleek desk and towering shelves of awards and plaques. Mr. Walker was all business, his sharp eyes fixed on me. "Let's cut to the chase," he said. "Our reporting system is outdated and slow. It's costing us time and money. Can you fix it?" I took a deep breath. "I can try, but I'll need to understand exactly what's wrong and what you're looking for." He nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Good answer. Here's the issue." For the next 30 minutes, he explained the complexities of their system. I scribbled notes as fast as I could, my brain racing to keep up. By the time he finished, I felt overwhelmed, but also exhilarated. "Think you can handle it?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," I said, surprising even myself. "I'll have a prototype ready in a week." He smiled faintly. "Good. Don't waste my time." The moment I left his office, panic set in. A week? What had I just promised? I didn't even know where to start. But as I rode the bus home that night, I reminded myself why I'd started this journey in the first place. If I wanted to turn my life around, I had to take risks. This was my chance to prove what I was capable of. That week was a blur. Every night after work, I buried myself in research and coding, running on coffee in sheer determination. I hit roadblocks constantly, bugs in the code, features that didn't work the way I needed them to, but I refused to give up. By the time the deadline rolled around, I had something resembling a prototype. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. When I walked back into Mr. Walker's office to present it, my heart was pounding so hard I thought he'd hear it. I hooked up my laptop to his monitor and walked him through what I'd built. He didn't say much at first, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he said, "This is good. Real good." I nearly collapsed with relief. "How much do you want for it?" he asked. I hadn't even thought about pricing. $2,000. I said, hoping I didn't sound as unsure as I felt. "Done," he said, opening a drawer and pulling out a checkbook. $2,000. I could barely process it. That was more money than I made in 2 months as a janitor. As I walked out of his office, check in hand, I realized something: this wasn't just a side hustle anymore. This was the start of something bigger. Walking out of Mr. Walker's office with that $2,000 check felt surreal. I kept checking my pocket to make sure it was still there. For the first time, I felt like I was worth more than just my hourly wage. I felt like I had something to offer, something valuable. That night, sitting on my futon, I stared at the check and thought about what it represented. This was the proof that I could do more, be more. But it was also a wake-up call. If I wanted to keep moving forward, I couldn't stay where I was. The next day, I went to work with a knot in my stomach. For hours, I cleaned floors, emptied trash bins, and replayed the same question in my head: was it time to quit? By the time my shift ended, I'd made up my mind. I walked into the supervisor's office, hands shaking. "Hey, Carl," I said. "Do you have a minute?" Carl looked up from his desk, surprised. "What's up, John?" I need to give my 2 weeks' notice," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. His brow furrowed. "You're quitting? Why? Did something happen?" "No, it's nothing like that," I said quickly. I have an opportunity to do something different. Something I've always wanted to try." Carl leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment. Then he smiled. "Good for you, John. Most people never take the leap." Walking out of that office was like shedding a second skin. I felt lighter, freer, but also terrified. Quitting my job meant there was no safety net. If I failed, there'd be no paycheck to fall back on. But I couldn't let fear win. I'd come too far to back down now. With my 2 weeks left, I threw myself into building my next project. I wanted something bigger, something that could reach more people. Inspired by Mr. Walker's request, I decided to create a customizable reporting tool that businesses could adapt to their needs. I spent every waking hour coding, testing, and tweaking. By the time my last shift as a janitor ended, I had a working prototype ready to go. Leaving that building for the final time was bittersweet. Part of me was terrified about what lay ahead, but a bigger part was excited. For the first time in years, I wasn't cleaning up after other people. I was building something of my own. With my janitor job officially behind me, I had nothing but time and pressure. The $2,000 I'd made from Mr. Walker's project was a great start, but it wasn't enough to sustain me for long. I needed to make my new venture work, and fast. I spent the next few weeks refining my reporting tool, making it more user-friendly and flexible. But building the product was only half the battle. The real challenge was selling it. How was I supposed to convince businesses to take a chance on a nobody like me? The first thing I did was research every small business within a 10-mile radius. Restaurants, retail stores, local service providers, anyone who might need help streamlining their operations. Armed with a list, I printed out flyers advertising my tool and spent entire afternoons walking door to door. It was humbling, to say the least. Some people dismissed me outright. Others politely listened before saying, "We'll think about it." A few flat out laughed. But then, after a week of rejections, I got my first break. I was visiting a small accounting firm when the owner, a no-nonsense woman named Linda, asked me to sit down. "Okay, John," she said, tapping the flyer I'd handed her. "You're telling me you've built a tool that can save my team hours on reporting. Show me." My hands were shaking as I pulled out my laptop and walked her through a demo. I explained how the tool could automate data aggregation, customize reports, and reduce errors, all things she'd mentioned were pain points during our conversation. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "How much?" I scrambled to come up with a number. $500 for the basic package. Custom features would cost extra. "Done," she said without hesitation. But I need it ready for my team by Monday. I could have jumped out of my chair in excitement, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I'll get it done," I said confidently, even though I had no idea how I was going to meet her deadline. That weekend was a blur of coding and troubleshooting. I barely slept, fueled by caffeine and the sheer determination not to let this opportunity slip through my fingers. By the time Monday rolled around, I delivered the tool on time, and it worked perfectly. Linda was thrilled. She even referred me to 2 of her business contacts, both of whom became paying clients within the month. Slowly but surely, word of mouth began to spread. My calendar started filling up with meetings, and for the first time, I felt like I had a real shot at making this work. But just when I thought things were finally falling into place, life threw me another curveball. One evening, I got a call from Simon Hayes, the same Simon Hayes who'd borrowed my phone charger that fateful night months ago. "John," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I hear you've been building something interesting. I want to meet." My heart nearly stopped. Simon Hayes wanted to meet me. When Simon Hayes called, I could barely string 2 words together. He was one of the most influential entrepreneurs in the city, and now he wanted to meet me. I didn't even know how he'd heard about my work. Yeah. Sure, I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Good," he said. "Be at my office tomorrow at 10 a.m. Don't be late." The call ended, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. Tomorrow? I didn't even own a proper suit. I spent that night frantically preparing, reworking my pitch, and practicing answers to every question I thought he might ask. By the time I left for his office the next morning, I was running on pure adrenaline. Simon's office was on the top floor of a gleaming skyscraper. The kind of place that screamed wealth and success. As I stepped off the elevator, I was greeted by a sleek receptionist who led me to a massive conference room. Simon was already there, sitting at the head of the table. He looked just as sharp and intimidating as I remembered. "John," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "Let's get right to it. Tell me about this tool you've been building." I swallowed hard and launched into my pitch, explaining how my reporting tool worked and how it could save businesses time and money. I showed him my laptop, walking him through a demo. He didn't say much as I talked, his face unreadable. By the time I finished, I was practically sweating. "Interesting," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "You've got something here, but it's small scale. What's your vision for this?" That question caught me off guard. Vision? Up until now, I'd been focused on just getting by. I hadn't thought much beyond my next client. I think it has potential," I said, scrambling for words. "With the right support, it could scale to help businesses on a much larger level." Simon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'll be honest with you, John. You've got talent, but talent alone isn't enough. You need strategy, connections, and capital if you want to grow." I wasn't sure where he was going with this, but I nodded, hanging on his every word. "I'm willing to invest," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. $50,000, in exchange for 20% of your business." My jaw dropped. $50,000. That was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. But giving up 20% of my business? That felt huge. Simon must have seen the hesitation on my face. "Think about it," he said. "I can open doors for you that you can't open on your own. But you need to decide if you're ready to take this to the next level." He handed me a card. "Call me when you've made up your mind." I left the meeting in a daze. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but it was also a gamble. Was I ready to give up a piece of my dream to take it further? That night, I barely slept. Every scenario played through my mind, the risks and rewards fighting for dominance. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I picked up the phone and dialed Simon's number. "I'm in," I said. After agreeing to Simon Hayes' investment, my life went into overdrive. The next week, we signed the paperwork, and just like that, $50,000 landed in my business account. For someone who used to stretch every dollar of a janitor's paycheck, it felt surreal to see that many zeros next to my name. But Simon didn't just hand over money and disappear. True to his word, he opened doors I never could have imagined. He introduced me to his network, executives, investors, and potential clients who could take my tool to the next level. Suddenly, I was in meetings with people who actually listened to my ideas, instead of brushing me off as just some guy. Of course, the pressure was intense. With Simon's money and reputation on the line, failure wasn't an option. I used the investment to hire a small team, 2 developers and a freelance designer, and we got to work refining my product. Simon had one big demand: scalability. "What you've built is great for small businesses," he said during one of our strategy sessions, "but if you want to make real money, you need to think bigger. Mid-size companies, corporations, they need solutions like this, too." It was a daunting challenge. Scaling up meant rewriting code, adding features, and stress-testing the system to handle larger datasets. There were nights when I thought I'd bitten off more than I could chew, but I reminded myself why I'd started this journey in the first place. By the end of the first quarter, we launched the new version of the tool, rebranded as Streamline Pro. It was slicker, faster, and packed with features tailored for businesses of all sizes. Simon pushed me to go all in on marketing. He had me book ad space on platforms I never thought I'd afford and hired a PR agency to spread the word. Before I knew it, Streamline Pro was getting attention. A week after the launch, I got my first major corporate client, a regional logistics company that signed a 6-figure contract to integrate Streamline Pro into their operations. 6 figures. The kind of money I'd never dreamed of making. That deal wasn't just a financial win, it was validation on a whole new level. It proved that my idea wasn't just a side hustle or a lucky break. It was a business. The success snowballed from there. With each new client, my confidence grew. I stopped doubting myself and started thinking bigger. If I could land 1 corporate client, why not 5? Why not 10? Simon kept pushing me, always challenging me to aim higher. "This is just the beginning," he said. "You've got momentum now, don't waste it." And he was right. But with success came challenges I hadn't anticipated. Balancing the demands of a growing business, managing a team, and dealing with the high expectations of my clients and investors, it all started to weigh on me. Still, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back. Success felt incredible, until it didn't. By the 6-month mark, my company was growing faster than I could have imagined. We'd landed more clients, hired additional staff, and expanded our product offerings. On paper, everything looked perfect. But behind the scenes, I was drowning. Every day felt like a marathon. Meetings, client calls, product updates, hiring decisions, it was relentless. My phone never stopped buzzing, my inbox was a minefield, and sleep became a distant memory. I thought being a janitor was exhausting, but this was a whole new level of pressure. One night, after an especially brutal day, I found myself sitting alone in my office, staring at a stack of invoices. My team had done great work, but scaling up meant bigger expenses, office space, software licenses, salaries. Even with the revenue coming in, cash flow was tight. I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake. Maybe I'd grown too fast. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this after all. That's when Simon called. "How's everything going?" he asked, his voice calm and steady as always. "Fine," I lied, trying to sound confident. He wasn't buying it. "John, I've been in this game a long time. I know the signs. Talk to me, what's going on?" For a moment, I hesitated. But then the floodgates opened. I told him everything, about the stress, the sleepless nights, the constant fear of failure. Simon listened patiently, then said something I'll never forget: "You're trying to do everything yourself. That's your problem." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "John, you're not a janitor anymore," he said. "You don't have to mop every floor yourself. You've built something incredible, but if you want it to survive, you need to learn how to delegate. Trust your team. Let them carry some of the weight." It was a simple piece of advice, but it hit me like a ton of bricks. He was right. I'd been so used to handling everything on my own that I couldn't see the obvious. I wasn't just a one-man operation anymore. I had a team of talented people who wanted to help. The next day, I called a meeting with my staff. I admitted that I'd been trying to take on too much and that it was time to divide responsibilities. I asked them to step up, and to my surprise, they were eager to do so. As I let go of some control, things started to shift. I had time to focus on the bigger picture, securing new clients, refining our strategy, and planning for the future. The weight on my shoulders didn't disappear entirely, but it felt manageable for the first time in months. By the end of the year, my company wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. We'd crossed the 7-figure revenue mark, something I never thought possible just a few months earlier. But even with all the success, I couldn't forget where I'd started. The janitor in me, the guy who used to clean floors and empty trash cans, was still there, reminding me to stay humble and grateful. The anniversary of my leap from janitor to entrepreneur arrived quietly, with little fanfare. It was a crisp January morning when I sat in my office, staring at the latest numbers from my accountant. The words were clear: net income, $1,024,367. I leaned back in my chair, letting it sink in. A year ago, I was mopping floors and living paycheck to paycheck. Now, I was a millionaire. The thought didn't feel real, it felt like a story I was reading about someone else. I thought back to all the moments that had led to this one. Finding the millionaire mindset under Mr. Larson's desk. Meeting Simon Hayes. Spending countless nights coding until my eyes burned. And yes, even the failures, the rejections, the stress, the self-doubt. Every step, every misstep, had brought me here. Later that day, I decided to mark the occasion in the simplest way possible. I went back to the office building where I'd spent so many years as a janitor. Walking through those familiar halls, I was struck by how much my perspective had changed. The place hadn't changed, but I had. I found Carl, my old supervisor, in the break room. He did a double take when he saw me. "John. Is that you? What are you doing here?" "I just wanted to say thanks," I said. "For giving me a chance when I needed it." Carl chuckled. "Didn't expect to see you in a suit, that's for sure. What have you been up to?" Running a business, I said with a smile. Things are going well. As I walked out of that building for the last time, I realized that being a millionaire wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that I'd proven to myself that I could change my story. The janitor who once thought life had passed him by had turned it all around. And the best part? This was only the beginning.